Hello, everybody, in our part of the internet. Today, we have, I think, great opportunity to talk about one of the hottest topics in economics currently, taxation. The one thing that we try to forget, but sometimes it lurks back. And after a deep recession, the crisis, many governments around the world are thinking of increasing their revenues. And taxes became one of the most seen political goals of the American administration after the change in power in January this year. We have a proposal of a minimum corporate income tax of 50%, 15% overall in the world. But there are also other types of taxes coming in. The European Commission is thinking of different kinds of green taxes that could be introduced. Overall, governments are also trying to increase corporate taxation. This happened in the US and the UK. Probably there are other taxes to follow in order to fill in the gap caused by the deep recession and the costs for the fiscal finances and for the public through 2020 and 2021. According to our paper, which now is going to be presented by Łukasz Błoński from the strategy team, and then Agnieszka Więcewicz-Price is going to have the, I think, great pleasure to have Alex come to discuss this and other taxation-related issues. We could gain approximately 700 billion US dollars overall if we introduce the different three types of taxes, which are covered in the paper, and Łukasz is going to present just in a moment. Not to make this debate any longer, I give the floor to Łukasz right now.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen, so how it works. Can you see the presentation and hear me well?
Yes, we do.
Great. So hello, everyone. My name is Łukasz Błoński. I represent the strategy unit at the Polish Institute of Economy. And I will present our latest paper, Global Taxes in the Post-COVID Era. $695 billion. What could we achieve with it? What could we buy with it? With that kind of money, we could vaccinate the whole world 4 times. With that kind of money, we could hire 55 million additional nurses, so much needed during the latest pandemic, which would also boost the quality of public service. With that kind of money, we could actually achieve United Nations Sustainable Development Goal of energy efficiency. And that kind of money could be collected annually thanks to global taxes that we propose introducing. Global taxes. Why do we want to propose global taxes? First of all, because they are unavoidable. If all countries agree on a certain rate and certain mechanisms, there would be so much less negative externalities such as profit shifting, tax evasion, carbon leakage. Furthermore, the ones that we are trying to propose, they have very small effect on economic growth. That's why we believe that $695 billion could be collected annually from 3 global taxes with rather conservative rates. The first one would be global minimum CIT rate and digital tax, and here we follow the regime of the OECD. The second one would be the wealth tax with revenues of $289 billion. And the last one, climate tax, could provide around $280 billion in tax revenues. What was our idea behind the introduction of these global taxes? So in 2020, the deficits in developed countries, they grew by 10 percentage points in comparison to 2019. In the meantime, the average statutory rate of CAT tax decreased from 30% in 2000 to 21.5 in 2020. And this race to the bottom, it was accompanied by massive profit shifting to tax havens. And I do not mean only Caribbean islands, but also tax havens in the European Union. And countries lose as much as $240 billion every year. And this is rather a conservative estimate, because the think tank of our guest estimates much higher revenues loss, up to $430 billion. At the same time, around 6.5 trillion wealth is transferred to offshore accounts just to escape tax administration. And it leads to a situation where 85% of global wealth was owned in 2019 by 10% of world's population, whereas the bottom half owned less than 1%. And 2020, that year, it proved the importance of efficient state, because our expectations towards health service, towards education, they remain unchanged. But if states, they decide to consolidate fiscally, and they cannot effectively tax highest incomes or highest wealth, they will resort to taxing consumption or middle-level labor. As a consequence, it will be the middle class that will be hit the most, and these inequalities will be growing larger and larger, and the quality of public service will be only decreasing. So now let me move to our first tax, which would be the global minimum CAT and digital tax. As a result of profit shifting, countries like Germany loses around 26% of its annual CAT revenues because of profit shifting. UK loses around 25%. Poland loses 8%. At the same time, the revenues of countries such as Ireland, they grow by 67%, of Netherlands 37%. And to combat this profit shifting and at the same time provide revenues to countries where digital services are actually sold, we provide two solutions. In both of them, the global revenue threshold would be around 750 million euros. And in digital tax, we assume the minimum profitability of multinational companies at the level of 10%, whereas minimum 20% of their taxable income would be reallocated to market jurisdictions. The second proposal would be the minimum CAT rate with 15% effective tax rate and substance carve-out. So the real activity would be taken out of this CAT tax. And thanks to it, we achieve $127 billion revenues. The digital tax provides up to 12 million, the minimum globe and US regime, because this is American proposal where the guilty already exists. So this top-up mechanism could provide up to $115 billion. Altogether, it makes up for $127 billion. Let's move to the second one, which would be the global wealth tax. In 2020, just in 1 year, the wealth of billionaires, it grew from $8 trillion to over $13 trillion. So in just 1 year, their wealth has grown by $5 trillion. At the same time, recently, we have seen the article of ProPublico depicting how greatly the wealth of 25 wealthiest Americans has expanded between 2014, 2018, and how little taxes they have actually paid. That's why we propose to tax multimillionaires only 0.01% of the wealthiest. That would be the first group that would be taxed with 0.5 tax rate, which is rather low, where the threshold would be $10 million. The second group would be billionaires with the threshold of their wealth above $1 billion, and the tax rate applicable would be 1.5%. And with our estimates based on the Forbes billionaire list and World Inequality Database, we assume that millionaires, so 0.01 wealthiest, they would pay $132 billion a year, whereas billionaires would pay $156 billion a year. So altogether, yearly, they would provide $289 billion. I will move to the third proposals. So temperatures around the globe are rising rapidly. As we can look outside of the window today in Warsaw, for the last week, we've been having a heat wave. At the same time, the west of Poland has been flooded yesterday. So this rising global temperatures and at the same time climate anomalies, they are escalating. And in order to combat it, we propose the introduction of 17 climate clubs based on William Nordhaus' proposal. We created 17 clubs, each presents similar level of socioeconomic development and CO2 emissions. And then we go to the pricing of these CO2 emissions. It would be based on EU ETS price for 3 years, because maybe it's worth mentioning that some states take it seriously and they try to combat climate changes, as for example, European Union, which has EU ETS pricing system. It has its own climate neutrality target. But at the same time, others, they are using their loose environmental policies to gain competitive advantage. They basically free-ride. So in this pricing, we take EU ETS price for the last 3 years, or like the last economic cycle, as a benchmark for other clubs. And then we adjust it to the level of each club, level of socioeconomic development. And for that, we take GDP per capita PPP and the United Nations Human Development Index. They serve as equally weighted variables adjusting price floors. We add a third discount mechanism, would be free emissions. So the poorest climate clubs, they would have additional free emissions of up to 75%, which after some time would be scaled down. And we also introduce a tariff system. We introduce a uniform 6% tariff based on CDICE model by Nordhaus. This is the level where countries are unwilling to opt out of climate clubs because it would be too expensive for them. And taking it all into consideration, our global revenues with the climate tax, they could be up to $280 billion. So altogether, we estimate that we could gain almost $7 billion with these 3 taxes. Some may raise questions. Is it possible? Is it doable? And here I would like to finish on a more personal note, because when I was starting my adventure at the OECD in 2016, there were very few who were supposed that we could have global taxes. Country by country tax reporting was all that everyone dreamt of. 5 years later, we are in 2021, and G7 accepts minimum CAT rate. It is not a perfect solution, but somehow we got there. G7 discusses carbon border tax. And I believe that it takes time, and actually we do not have that much of a time, but we are slowly getting there. We are slowly getting to the implementation of global tax idea. Thank you very much. That was all from my side. Thanks.
Thank you, Łukasz. It was a very impressive presentation, and I welcome you all and thank you for giving the time to spend this half an hour with us today. And special thanks to our distinguished guest, Mr. Alex Cobham, who's Chief Executive of the UK-based Tax Justice Network. He's an economist and a founding member of the steering group of the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation. Alex has been a researcher at Oxford University, but also a countless number of charities and national and international organizations, including the UN and the World Bank. He's the author of 2 recently published books, which we highly recommend you read if you're interested in these issues. The first one, titled The Uncounted, shows how statistical underrepresentation of disadvantaged groups lead to their marginalization, both in political power and public spending. And the second book, published by Oxford University Press, is called Estimating Illicit Financial Flows, a critical guide to the data, methodologies, and findings. Alex, welcome, and thank you for giving your time to us today. I have a lot of questions that could be answered with a book each, I suppose, but our time limitations don't allow us for such a luxury. We would also like to include our audience in this discussion. So if you do have any questions, please use the chat function and we can try to address them toward the end of our discussion. But I would like to start by picking up on what Łukasz said toward the end of his presentation. It seems that we have come a long way from just starting to think about the concept of global taxation to actually materializing it and coming to an agreement at the forum of G7. But to come down to more detail, I would like to ask about one thing that is mentioned in the report. Our minimum global corporate income tax estimates are based on the assumptions made by the OECD, as Łukasz mentioned. They're relatively low compared to the minimum effective tax rate that is proposed by your organization, the Tax Justice Network. Do you see any chance that the world could agree to higher effective tax rates, as high as 25%? And further distribution of benefits that would come from it if so many states are opposing to the G7 agreement?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me just say, by the way, I think this is a really useful and interesting report, and it kind of lays out the scale of the type of revenues that we could achieve by acting globally. And there is a real shift. You know, if you look from when the Tax Justice Network was set up in 2003, almost 20 years during which we've gone from being, I think, a voice that was often seen as completely unrealistic, asking for utopian things that could never happen, to actually having set a lot of the global policy agenda, because the world has shifted. You know, the narratives around what is possible and what is good have really shifted. And so the type of measures that Łukasz has set out really do now feel realistic in a way that even 5 years ago, I think they wouldn't have done. So this is a really important conversation. But on that specific question, I think there's 2 things to think about with the OECD proposal. So what they do is they identify for multinational companies in each country where they operate the effective tax rate on the profits they're declaring. And if that's below, well, 15%, as it seems to be, if it's below 15%, then the undertaxed profits can be topped up. Now, in the OECD proposal, there's 2 things there. That topping up, or the right to top those taxes up, goes to the headquarters country in the first instance. And that means it's mainly the bigger OECD countries, and particularly the G7. So we think the G7 gets slightly more than 60% of the revenues under the OECD proposal. And then the second piece is the rate to which you top up. In the OECD proposal, you top up to the agreed minimum, so perhaps 15%. Now, in our proposal, the meter, or minimum effective tax rate, we do 2 things differently. So we identify the undertaxed profits in the same way, but then we say, firstly, in terms of who gets to top up the tax, that actually it should be shared more equally. So not just the headquarters countries, but in fact, in proportion to where the multinational companies are really operating, where their sales take place, where their employment is. And that means you get a much broader share of the benefits outside of the G7 and the OECD, because many countries, particularly lower income countries, are just the host country for multinationals. They're not the headquarters, and they should have a share of this too. The other piece, though, is instead of saying let's top it up to the minimum rate, we say where there are undertaxed profits, they should be topped up to the statutory headline rate in those countries, because otherwise you're still giving an incentive to shift profits into low tax jurisdictions, because you know it will only get topped up to 15. If you know it will get topped up to the headline rate, then the incentive for profit shifting is basically gone. Now, what that means is you get not just a fairer distribution, but a significantly larger volume of revenues. So we think the OECD approach at 15% potentially raises as much as $275 billion if it's applied fully globally. But using our approach, the meter, that could be as much as $460 billion. So a much higher share of revenues. To put that in context, for Poland, for example, at 15%, Poland would receive perhaps $750 million, maybe 7% or so of the current corporate income tax revenues. With the meter, it would be double that, about $1.5 billion. So it's a big shift for a country that isn't primarily a headquarters country. And going to the question about the politics, you know, if we look at the G20, most of the G20 countries are in a similar position, whether that's India, China, Argentina, South Africa, all of them would do much better. And indeed, the G7 countries themselves would do somewhat better under our proposal. So we think there's a window now to there'll be some discussions for the G20 meeting in July and the inclusive framework meeting that starts next week. And then the October meeting of the G20 will see a decision probably. That's a window in which countries, including Poland, can really push for a fairer distribution and a more ambitious application. Lastly, you know, we'd obviously like to see a rate of at least 25% to really end the race to the bottom. But even starting with 15, you can see how over time you could then build on that global agreement and raise it. And 15 would be pretty ambitious simply because of how little tax the largest multinationals actually pay. So that would be a starting point. As long as it's done reasonably fairly and effectively, that gives you somewhere to build. So that would be, you know, that would be good progress for this year, let's say.
Thank you. Well, on the political note, one more thing, you mentioned Poland should push for it, and it's a very convincing and a plausible scenario, which is drawn there. But how do you think the multinational dialogue regarding tax issues could be structured to include the voices of those who don't seem to count in this debate?
I mean, that's a fundamental point, and I think that goes to everything that Łukasz has presented. If we are accepting that the way ahead to meet common global goals like the Sustainable Development Goals and to fight common challenges like the climate crisis and the pandemic require these global revenue raising measures, then we need a forum, an architecture in which we can come to those sorts of global decisions. I think the OECD has been in charge of these international tax rules really since the 1960s, but the current reform process since 2013, and has clearly failed to achieve the kind of progress that's needed. The fact that their most recent proposal gives such a large share of the benefits to their own members and so little to anyone else, I think is the final proof, if it were needed, that the OECD, as a club of rich countries, really is not an appropriate body to host the negotiation of global tax rules. That's why there's a good chance, we think, that the UN Secretary General in September may announce the start of negotiations on a UN tax convention, effectively a framework convention on tax, broadly equivalent to the framework convention on climate change, to allow the same type of global negotiations about tax as we have under the UNFCCC on climate change. The UN is the body that is set up for global negotiations of technical issues with competing interests, and tax is very clearly one of them. It's almost strange that we haven't yet had tax move to the UN, but I think that's the road that we're on now.
It reminds me of an opinion once sounded by a senior member of the European Council who told me the conversation was about the harmonization of taxes in the EU. And that was about 7 years ago, I think, when he said, there's no way we can harmonize a lot of things in Europe, but certainly not taxes. And I think this is the voice of pessimism that shows it's so difficult to reconcile conflicting issues, but that you seem to be more hopeful. So I think that there is the ground that we can find to negotiate. Moving on, if I may, I would like to talk a bit about wealth tax as well. From one of the recent publications, we learned that The richest 25 Americans pay almost no income tax. Do you think that introduction of a wealth tax could help more effective taxation of the wealthiest? And how should such wealth tax be designed in order to eliminate the impact of shifting profits offshore?
This is a great proposal and very important. I think, you know, what we see in the ProPublica leak is not that those richest, wealthiest people in the United States have done anything illegal. Rather the opposite. The tax system makes it incredibly easy for them just not to pay very much, if any, tax at all. And that's a combination of their political power and the power of others like them to have changed the rules, the weakness of the tax authority. You know, the rate of the IRS has been so weakened by successive political decisions that they have very little power now to audit at the top. And then finally, the problem of offshore, that actually a great deal of wealth can be hidden. We know from other leaks that the top 1% and the top 0.1%, and particularly the top 0.01%, are overwhelmingly responsible for the majority of offshore tax evasion, which we estimate to be worth perhaps $180 billion of lost revenues worldwide each year. So a huge problem driven by a set of issues, including the politics. A wealth tax gets you through a lot of that where you can find the political will. And I think what we're seeing during the pandemic is a sense that a wealth tax is a basic element of fairness that's needed, firstly, to make sure that people who are declaring their wealth and incomes at the top end are fairly taxed, and secondly, to make sure that people at the top end who are not declaring their wealth and incomes are also brought into the system. They cannot be the wealthiest and the most antisocial in terms of their tax behaviour if we want to strengthen our societies, not just raising revenues, but making sure that we're all part of this social contract. So a wealth tax gives you both the opportunity for the revenues and also a tool to ensure that we know the beneficial ownership, who are the warm-blooded human beings behind every legal entity, every company, trust and foundation, every bank account, because we can simply tax higher where that's not declared to end the anonymity that makes it so easy for people to evade their tax responsibilities. Thomas Piketty proposed a wealth tax as much as anything at the global level to ensure that we simply have the data on ownership so we can understand wealth inequalities and we can think about politically what are our preferences for tolerating those very high inequalities or for curtailing them somewhat. The tax doesn't just raise revenue, it generates transparency. It deals with some of the problems of the uncounted at the top end by allowing us to see the inequality in the world we're living in. So definitely an important move. And we've already seen some major G20 countries like Argentina moving ahead with it. As they show the success of that approach, I think we'll see adoption more and more widely, and that in turn makes the possibility of a global measure all the more likely. The norms are shifting against the race to the bottom on corporate taxes and against the tolerance of high net wealth individuals simply not paying taxes at the same rate as the rest of us. So those global shifts become ever more feasible.
Do you think the pandemic has been a catalyzer for this sort of thinking about community spirit and responsibility of the wealthiest for the rest of the population? As we saw actually last year, some of the richest people in the world, especially in America, actually did volunteer to be taxed higher, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we see the voices of groups like the Patriotic Millionaires and Millionaires for Humanity coming out and saying, tax us. You know, we do want to be part of the social contract, even the wealthiest. At the same time, you know, the global financial crisis that began in 2008-9 really kicked off a process where the rich countries needed revenues almost for the first time in the same way as lower income countries had often done. And there was a moment of global solidarity around the idea, if not the practice, of improving international tax rules. With the pandemic, we have another moment. Everyone needs revenues to pay for their public health services and the costs of the economic recovery. That's especially urgent for lower income countries that don't have the same financial flexibility, but it's true for countries at all income levels. And what that forces is the conversation that we should have been having about the extent to which we have failed to tax the most wealthy, the highest income individuals, and the most profitable companies, some of which have done extremely well economically during the pandemic while everyone else has suffered. So I think that push of a public pressure for greater solidarity, for greater compliance, for greater inclusion is really clear in countries all around the world. And again, it supports both national measures and the shift towards, improving the global context with perhaps even the introduction of some global taxes.
So the great piece of wisdom that recommends we should not waste a good crisis seems to apply again, I suppose.
Very much.
Before I move on to my last question, I wanted to encourage our audience to chip in with their comments or questions that they might have for either Łukasz or Alex. I don't see anything in the chat yet, but you're welcome to raise your hand and give a try. My last question is about the future and the expansion of this debate on taxation. Since we have some progress in the debate on the minimum global CIT tax, do you think it could lead to some negotiations of other global taxes, such as climate tax, where negative externalities are almost as visible, if not more visible, than the case of profit shifting?
Definitely. I think we're moving both in terms of a recognition that national taxation, national tax sovereignty is actually best supported by global cooperation. For a long time, we've had this rather false argument about tax sovereignty, that somehow tax sovereignty means allowing every country to do whatever they want, regardless of how much damage it might do to the tax systems or indeed the climate of other countries and their citizens. What we're seeing now, even if the OECD minimum tax needs serious work, the narrative shift is a powerful one. This decision to end the race to the bottom, to say not that we need complete harmonization, but that we need a common floor, a common minimum set of standards, not only of rates, but also of the tax base and the way that tax systems nationally interact with each other internationally, so that we're not continually undermining our neighbours geographically or indeed globally. And that lends itself exactly to thinking about the kind of the global public good issues like the climate crisis, how we respond to that collectively. I think the only perhaps cautionary note on climate taxes is a recognition that at an international level, they can play out in the same way as some taxes on consumption at the national level, which is to say, although we shift the incentives for everyone in a good direction, the immediate impact of that may be regressive. So we may force the poorest people in a country or the poorest economies in the world to bear the burden if we're not very careful also to have offsetting transfers, and recognizing that the high income countries have far and away the greatest responsibility for the historic carbon emissions and other climate damage. It is the high income countries that need to make sure they are the ones bearing the financial cost of the tax, even if we're shifting the incentives about emissions for everyone. So lower income countries need to be very fully compensated. Indeed, we could see this as a question of climate reparations, because often those countries, of course, suffer the greatest damage from the climate crisis too. So there is a lot of issues in there before we can, I think, simply move to a financial measure. And again, they lend themselves to global negotiations to take into account the different perspectives. And so again, this idea of a UN framework convention on tax to create an intergovernmental body for negotiations at the UN seems like one that's really gathering momentum. It'll take time, but we have time. We've been on the OECD tax reform process for 8 years without yet getting any real progress. We know these things take time, and they will take time at the UN too. But there is an appetite and there is a need for us globally to start responding globally to what are global problems.
So again, this is really about raising awareness and perhaps using the platform that is being built for the corporate income tax to also talk about the other issues. Thank you. There's one question from the audience, and it concerns wealth tax. The question is as follows: what risk is there that a wealth tax actually doesn't change global inequality much because the money would stay in rich countries?
So this is an interesting question, and it depends a bit on the way that you think a global wealth tax would work. And this is, it's a question that we often get with financial transactions taxes on transactions in financial markets. Of course, most of the financial markets, or in this case, most of the wealth, is in the high income countries. So would a global tax simply generate revenues in those high income countries? And then you'd have the same problem we have now of whether those countries are willing to share revenues. But I think what this overlooks is the fact that wealth inequalities are in general higher in lower income countries, and so the relative revenue benefits would be greater in those countries than in high income countries. And secondly, that the problem of offshore tax evasion is, if anything, more intense in lower income countries, so that again, regularizing, making transparent the ownership of assets, particularly of the most wealthy, would again be disproportionately beneficial for lower income countries. So this really is one of those measures that's potentially win-win. By putting the global architecture in place to be able to tax wealth at a global level, you're likely to generate systematically higher benefits in the countries that currently lose most, that is the lower income countries. And of course, everyone would benefit, so everyone has an incentive to participate and to make sure that we have that transparency about who the ultimate owners of companies and trusts and foundations and financial assets really are. There is, a very clear argument that, in a sense, we'd all win, except those very wealthy individuals who are currently, at least to some extent, outside of the systems, including the tax systems and the social contract that the rest of us are all part of.
Thank you. I wonder, given the animosity that surrounds the issue of taxing wealth, especially the richest echelons, if simply banning billionaires wouldn't be a better idea, because it would reverse the emotions around it and would just prevent people from getting too rich and too strong politically, but still they would have to do the distribution of their wealth themselves and perhaps create other sort of incentives to do that. But I'm afraid this is a topic for another discussion. We exceeded the limit of our time for today. Thank you so much, Alex, for being with us today. Thank you, Łukasz. Thank you all. And I highly recommend you page through and read carefully, those who are interested in the topic, the report written by Łukasz and the books by Alex, which together found some great pillar for future discussions surrounding global taxation. Thank you so much. Have a good day.